Now that we've got all of the functionality to like, comment, and save posts, and one mistake that I realize is we need to actually clear our comment whenever we make it. So we need to call set content and pass in just an empty string after it's submitted. The last thing that we need to do as concerns the functionality that we see here when it comes to liking, for example, a post, is we need to actually enable notifications so that when one user likes another user's post, they get a notification for it. So the way that we're going to do that is by setting up another table for notifications. So we'll go to Data, Add a Table, Notifications, and here we're going to have a few more columns. Of course, we're going to have an ID that's generated when a new notification is made. We're going to have created at, which is also going to be automatically created. It's going to use the now function. And here we're going to need not only information about the post ID, the ID of the, and we don't want to randomly generate it, the post ID, the notification that this is related to, in terms of the post that a user acted on, as well as the user ID. But we also want the profile ID, the recipient that is of the notification. So the person who likes, let's say this is a like, the ID of the user who performed the like, and then the profile ID, the person who owns the actual post that should receive the notification. It's also going to be of type UUID. And we're going to need to include a type of notification. There's going to be a couple of types. There's going to be one notification for likes and another for follows, which we'll set up later. So this type is going to be of type text. And again, we'll select the primary key of ID. So with that made, we're going to go back to our save button, and remember we passed through, or not the save button, the like button, and remember we passed through the author ID. That's what we're going to set the profile ID to. So we're going to need to add a new variable of profile ID to our like post mutation. And we're going to need to do the same for profile ID of type UUID, and do the same for unlike post too, I believe. And note that the reason for this is that when we like a post, we want to create a new notification or insert a notification. So let me just write this out in graphical again. This isn't going to have a name because we're going to put it in the exact same variable. We're going to perform two mutations at the same time. So this is going to be, we can write the mutation, add a new mutation, and in it we're going to insert notifications. And what are we going to provide here? Well, on objects, we're going to select the post ID, the user ID, and the profile ID. And the type here is going to be set, it's going to be hard-coded to like. Now we can copy all of this and paste it in here and write in all of the appropriate variable values. And again, we can just return affected rows. So that's it for inserting a notification, but we also want to delete a notification. So for doing that, let's add a new one. We select delete notifications, and we want to do it where, and select the post ID and add it where it's equal to whatever we pass in. The profile ID is equal to what we passed in, and the same for user ID. And again, that's going to be of type like, where type is equal to like. And again, return affected rows. So make sure, be precise about this and make sure all of the variables are written correctly, otherwise this won't work as you would expect. So we'll save everything, and now we don't have to do anything else. We don't have to perform a separate mutation. We don't have to write something else. This is going to be done right whenever we like a given post. So right now, let me see if I've already liked it. Make sure you've not liked the post. But when you do like it, go to your Data tab and check out notifications and make sure that that's created with all the correct info and that it can be successfully removed as well. I'm going to make sure that that's right, and it is. And then we'll take care of the next part of it, which is showing the notification to the appropriate user that's connected to the profile ID. So this is obviously what we're checking up here. And what we want to do is we want to display a notification tooltip when there's some notifications that haven't been checked. And I mentioned this earlier, but we want to show notifications for which they are sooner, or a more recent date, I should say, than whatever's stored on the user for last checked. That last checked column right here. So the first thing that we'll need to do is we're going to need to update our subscriptions. We're going to need to update our Me subscription to include notifications. We're going to need to add the notifications field, and it's going to need to be ordered by the created at timestamp in descending order. And I'm going to write this all directly within the JavaScript file, but you can take this subscription and write it once again in the console if you need to. We're going to select the ID, the type, created at of each notification, and if there's a post associated with it, we're going to want to grab the ID and the media. Remember that we need to grab the media to display right here at the very end, so users can click on that and go to the individual post. Then we're going to grab the user that it came from, that liked it, for example, or that is following you. User, including their ID, username, and profile image. We want to display that on the left here. And I believe that's it. So next we want to head to the nav bar, and this is how we're showing the tooltip. We're showing the tooltip in the links part of it. And up at the top we're going to need to grab Me. So we've already grabbed him, so that's good. But now we need to determine what are the new notifications. And the way that we're going to do that is by taking the notifications array, and it looks like we're getting an error here, so maybe I wrote this a little bit incorrectly. This is a good reason to do this in the console sometimes. But sometimes we get lazy and we think, well, we don't need to do that, so let me fix this. Let me write this out and make sure that it works. So I'll go to the console here. And I spelled notifications wrong. Or here's the problem. I forgot a step. We're going to need to set up a relationship, of course, between notifications and users. So for users, they're going to need to have an array relationship, and the name is going to be notifications. It's going to reference the table notifications. It's going to be from the ID of them to the profile ID. And then for notifications, we'll have an object relationship for user, and this is going to reference the table users from user ID to ID. Okay, now we should be able to query for notifications. And we're also going to need to set one up with post. So for posts, we're going to have an array relationship notifications, reference table notifications from the ID to the post ID. Then on notifications, an object relationship called post. This shouldn't be called notifications, this should be called user. And an object relationship called post, referencing the table posts from the post ID to the ID. All right, let's try this now. Okay, good. So finally we can get an array of notifications. We don't have any at the moment, but let me refresh. And the reason for that is I'm not selecting the current, I'm not looking at the current user, but yes, if I were to grab this particular user, you can see that there's one notification. There's actually, yeah, there's one notification here with all of the notification data, the post, and then the on which post it was made and the user that it's coming from, the user who performed the like. Okay. So now that we've resolved that, and I didn't spell notifications wrong, we can include all of these fields, and here in navbar, we're getting me, and we want to check to see what the new notifications are, which will store in a variable. So here we're going to take me.notifications, that array, and we want to filter it. We want to filter it according to when it was created. So again, we can destructure the parameters and get the created at, the value for when it was created, and then we can do a comparison to see if it's after when we last checked. If it's after when we last checked, then it's a new notification. And conveniently, for the date library that we're going to use, the date formatting library that we're going to use, date functions, there's a nice function called isAfter, which we can import, and it takes two dates and checks to see if the date provided as the first argument is after the one provided as the second. So we can say new date created at, and then as the second one, me.last checked. So it's going to filter it according to that criteria. And if we just console log the result for new notifications, we should have one, because at the moment we haven't updated that value for last checked. It should still be null like it was initially. So we're getting an error, and the reason for that is it's saying can't read property filter of undefined. Forgot to save. So yep, we do see new notifications, and it consists of one in the array and just the one notification that we have. Perfect. Okay, so these are the new notifications, but we also want to create another variable that tells us whether we have notifications, and this is going to control the visibility of the tooltip itself. So if new notifications dot length is greater than 0, if we have a new one, then we are going to say that we have notifications. And then this is what's going to determine the visibility of the tooltip. It's not going to be set to true by default anymore. It's going to be controlled by has notifications. And then as for displaying the notifications themselves, we're going to pass down to notification list notifications from me.notifications. So here within notification list is where we're going to show the actual data for the notifications, and we're going to replace default notifications with that. Now, not to jump around too much, but we're not quite done with displaying the tooltip. Remember that for the tooltip, we want to show the accurate value of number of likes as well as number of follows. Well, we need to pass some data down to that to show that in this case there is one like. So we're going to go to the title prop for red tooltip and find notification tooltip, and for notifications that's going to be set to new notifications, whereas for the notification tooltip that's going to be all of them. So going into the notification tooltip, we can destructure notifications, and we want to figure out how many likes there are, how many number of likes notifications there are, how many like notifications there are, and how many follow notifications there are, and put them next to the icon. So we're going to first create a variable called follow count and one called like count. And we're going to use a function to count each of these values and name that count notifications. So this is going to accept the notification type, and it's going to filter according to that. So for follow count, we're going to call count notifications and pass in the type is follow, and for like count, it is like. So that's going to be passed through the parameters, and we're going to return notifications.filter, and we're going to filter to that filter according to that type. So we'll grab the type for each of the notifications and check to see if that type is equal to what we passed into the function. And then at the end, once we filter this array, we're going to get the number by measuring its length. So for the first count, followers, we're only going to show this div if follow count is greater than 0, in which case we're going to interpolate that value here, and we'll have the same approach for likes. Say follow count is greater than 0, and then if the like count is greater than 0, and interpolate that count. Good. And then for the notification list, for actually showing the notifications, I believe everything looks correct here. The only change I believe that we need to make is we want to interpolate the notification created at date. So we'll do that for both isLike and isFollow. And then for isFollow, we can pass down the ID from notification.user.id. So I believe all of that's correct. So let's save everything and see if we can get our notification tooltip to show up, as well as our one notification so far. And we can. The count is correct, one like, and we see our little dot there at the bottom. And good. Code Artistry likes your photo. Of course, we liked our own photo, but we see the date at the end, and we see the profile image, and we see the post itself that we can navigate to. However, we should assume that once we check our notification list, this red dot should go away, indicating that we don't have any new notifications left. But you'll see that if we refresh, it's still going to be there. We're not doing anything to clear those notifications. So whenever we open the list, whenever we click on the heart button, we want to clear the notifications. And the way we know now to do that is by updating the value of last checked. At the moment for our user, that we're looking at, actually all of our users, last checked is still set to null. So how are we going to update that? Well, here within notification list, we want to execute a mutation, and we want to do it when the component is visible. Let's say when the component mounts. So we're going to use the effect hook, and when it mounts, we want to clear notifications. So we'll collect all the variables that we need, and we're going to need just two variables here, one for the user ID, and that's going to come from the current user ID. So we can, back in navbar, let's destructure current user ID from context and pass it down to our notification list. And then grab that from props. So current user ID is going to be passed down to the ID variable. And then we're going to need to calculate when it was last checked. So for last checked, we can just create a string for the new date. So we'll get the current date and then turn that into an ISO string with the toISOString method. So that's going to store when this component mounted, and therefore when we last checked the notifications. Now for this, let's write out the mutation that we want to execute, and this really consists of updating our profile information. So we want to add a new mutation, and we're going to update the users where, and we want to select where the ID is equal to what we pass in, the user ID. So we'll call this check notifications, pass in user ID and last checked, both of those as variables, and we want to set, we want to find it where the ID is equal to the user ID, and we want to select set and update the last checked value with what's stored in the last checked variable. So that will be a string in required, and we don't need to return anything, so we'll just provide affected rows as our one field, and we'll pass in user ID. So let's make a mutation called check notifications. Export const check notifications and paste that in. Then we'll use mutation and import it, bring in check notifications, and get our function, mutate function, and then we'll call it at the end of our effect function, pass in our variables to it, and the last thing that we need to do is provide the dependencies current user ID and the check notifications function. And finally, to make sure that the little red dot goes away, we need to take the value of has notifications here in links and use it to conditionally set that class, the class that we're using to actually add that little red dot, and that was classes.notifications. So we'll add a ternary here. If has notifications is true, then we want to use that class. Otherwise, we'll just use an empty string and no class. So we're going to save everything and give this a shot. So at the moment, we have one like, and we're going to check it. And we see, boom, it immediately goes away due to our subscription. And when we click away from it and reload, we no longer see a notification up at the top. We don't see our notification tooltip. And the last thing that I think I want to do in this video is to format our dates. So we need to format the date here in our notifications, and for here it's going to be how long ago the notification was made, and the same for the comments here. However, for the post itself, we want to format the date according to the calendar date. so instead of 5 days ago, maybe it's, March 23rd. So we're going to create another utility file in our utils folder, and this is going to be called formatdate.js. And we're going to once again be relying on the great date utility library date functions. So we can go to datefunctions.org to see all the documentation for what we're going to be using, the different functions here. So let's take a look at the first one that we're going to be using, and this is going to be for formatting the calendar date. So we're going to call this function, and we're going to export it. Export function format post date, and it's going to accept a date. And generally speaking, when it comes to formatting a date into the kind of pattern that we want to use just the general format function. So we'll import format from date functions, and we want to kind of have two different versions of this date. First of all, if the post was made during this year, say it was on March 23rd, we want to format it as just March 23. But if it was made last year, and say it was February of last year, February 2nd, we would want to say February 2, 2019. We want to include the year if it's not the current year. So we're going to have a kind of a short version and a long version for formatting. So for the first kind of date, the short version, the month that we want is 4 capital M's, where we have the month spelled out, and then we just want to include the day of the month as a number, so we can just use lowercase d, and we want to convert that to uppercase because that's how it looks for Instagram post dates like this. And we want to do this for the longer version, February 2. Okay, so the first one is going to be stored in a variable called format short. We're going to call format, and we're going to need to pass the date to the date constructor, and then we provide the options as a string. If we look down, we can see the way that this function is called. You can see some examples. We provide a date first, and then we provide the second option as a string with all the variants that we chose. So we want MMMM in all caps, and then a lowercase d. Now for the long version, we want to put this in a variable called format long, and we want to add a comma afterwards and have the date spelled out, or I should say the year all included. So let's see, the year options, if we look for that, I believe it's all the way up at the top, and to get the entire year we want 4 lowercase y's, or I believe we could do 3 lowercase y's would yield the same. But now we need to figure out whether it's the current year or not. Well, the great thing about date functions is that if you think of some date comparison, I can almost guarantee that there's a specific function for that. So we can find a year helper that's going to tell us if it's the same year, or is this year. That's really what we want. Is the given date in the same year as the current date? So if it's not in 2020, we're going to use the long format. Otherwise, if it is the current year, we'll use the short format. So we're going to return the result of is this year. So we'll import that too, and pass new date. We'll pass the date to the date constructor, and if this resolves to true, we want the short version with format short, otherwise format long. So this is the first function that we're going to use. The next one is going to be called format date to now short. And this is going to include a short version. We're going to pass in the date to it, and it's going to include a short version of the current date to now. So what I mean by date to now is, say, the post was made 5 days ago. Instead of writing all this out, the short version of it is just going to be 5D. Or if it was 7 weeks ago, it would be 7W. And the same for months, years, etc. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to use a function which is called format distance. In particular, format distance strict. We would use format distance if we wanted the difference in, say, years ago or days ago, but since we don't want that suffix, we can just use format distance, and it's going to tell us just the distance and time and nothing else. So we want to pass in 2 dates. The first date is going to be the date that we're passing to the function, and then the second one is going to be some comparison date, which is really just going to be to now. There is a format distance to now strict, which apparently does what we want it to do without having to pass in 2 arguments, but I haven't been able to get that function to work yet. It's not exported from date functions. So here we're going to call format distance strict. We'll import it up at the top, format distance strict, and again we'll pass in the date that we want to format and then compare it to the current date. And the way that we can do that is pass just date.now to the date constructor. Now, this is going to require a little bit of work because it's still going to return to us, say, 4 days or 7 weeks. What we need to do is find a way to take these 2 parts, the number and then the unit of time. We need to kind of split them apart. We need to get just the first letter of the second element. So we're going to split this into an array. So for 5 days, it's going to be 5 and then days. And then we want to use an array so we can map over this and take the second element and just get the first letter and then combine this again so that it's join this so it's just 5D. So we're going to take the result of this and split it on a space, the space between the two, the space that's right here, split it on a space. We're going to map over that array. So we're going to take the string and the index of the element that we're iterating over currently. And if the index is 1, that is, if it's the second element, we're going to use a ternary here. If it's the second element, then we're just going to take the string and get the first letter in it. And we can do that with this array type notation S0. Otherwise, we just want to return the string as is, like that. And then finally, we want to join it all together. Join it from an array back to a string. And this is what we're going to return. So that was a lot, but it should get us the result that we want. So we can now use both of these functions. We're first going to start in the notification tooltip, and we'll begin with format date to now short. We'll import that, and we'll wrap it. Actually, it shouldn't be here. My mistake. It should actually be in the notification list. So here's where we'll grab format date to now short, and we're going to pass where we're displaying the created at value. We're going to pass that to format date to now short. The same for like and follow notifications. And then we'll go to post, the post component, and then import both of those functions. Format date to now short and format post date. So we'll start in our post component and we'll find where created at should be, and that's where I hard-coded the text 5 days ago. Here's where we want to put created underscore at and make sure that we destructure that. And then we will wrap it or pass it to format post date. And then we'll go down to author caption and pass that created at to format date to now short, and the same for the user comment component. Pass comment.created at to format date to now short. All right, so saving all of those files, and it looks like I already destructured created at before. Saving all these files, we should hopefully see our dates look a bit better. And for our post, we see when exactly they were made, 1 day ago, and the comment 49 minutes ago, and we see that the date, the post date isn't exactly as we want. I mentioned that it should be in uppercase, but I forgot to say to uppercase at the end for both format short and long. That should fix it. But the shortened dates are what we want them to be. And now that's capitalized, and the notification date is looking much better as well.